Welcome to LeaderIQ, where we share the stories of leaders in brand and retail so you can learn what led them to find success in their careers while giving you an intimate look at how they made foundational decisions along the way. This show is hosted by Guru Harry Heron, who is the founder and CEO of CommerceIQ. Guru has spent most of his career working as a leader at companies like Amazon and eBay before becoming an entrepreneur himself. This podcast is brought to you by CommerceIQ, a company which Guru started in 2019 that has become the e-commerce operating system for brands like Logitech, Johnson & Johnson, Kellogg's, Mars, Duracell, and many more. If you're interested in learning more, check out commerceiq.ai. With that, let's get to the show. Today's guest is Doug Straton, Chief Digital Officer at Hershey's. Doug and Guru discuss the differences between what it takes for leaders to succeed at startups as compared to large organizations, and they have an in-depth discussion on the future of e-commerce, drawing from Doug's experience crafting a 5-year strategy on the topic for Unilever, and more recently his amazing work at Hershey's. Here is your host, Guru Hari Haran and Doug Straton.
How you doing?
Good. How are you doing? Getting sleep?
I'm good. Last night was rough, but surviving. It's just the start stop is
that's the tough part, man.
Yeah. And last night was like 4 or 5 times, which was just like, anyway, I will survive.
Got it. So is it like, do you guys take turns that, hey, it's your turn?
I usually take the evening times. And then my wife, she does the days. But yesterday she just woke up a bit more frequently for some reason. Yeah. So, but she's been good so far. Like
she's got a feed, so she can't get away.
Yeah, exactly. I think our first daughter was definitely tougher. This one's like pretty straightforward. You feed her, she'll be quiet and go back to sleep. So
okay, got it.
as programmatic as I can get.
And you do have a playbook, at least.
No, exactly. Cool. So
interesting. I'm looking forward to the Doug one.
I'll tee it up just saying that if there's anything, because I know you put in some more questions around e-commerce, a bit how we think about like how he thinks about Hershey's. And so if there's anything that he doesn't, after the recording, he doesn't feel comfortable with, we can take it off. But I think, he doesn't have the same background as like Don, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think this is where you can get a little more, focused on what he's doing as a business. Hopefully we can sneak more of that into it. So, whatever can hopefully be helpful to you as you are trying to get the Hershey's business.
Well, I think we've been playing very well off of each other. I do like you coming in and asking some deeper questions. Sometimes I miss them. Sometimes I was about to ask, but it's also always good to mix up the voices and stuff. So if anything, I would just ask that we don't change too much. I think it's been going great. Okay,
cool.
What's actually one thing I was going to ask you, like based on the last, say, 3 or 4 or 5, whatever we've done, is there what's the key? Is there like outcome that we're trying to get to in these calls? Like, hey, if a listener listens to this, that they walk away with what? Like, you have a point of view on, or maybe the other question I had was like, what are the highs in these podcasts that we've done? Where do we get those highs?
Like highs is in like the key things to share with people, or what do you mean by highs?
Yeah, in terms of whether it's the listener takes away with something, or it's interesting and the listener walks away with something interesting, right?
Yeah, I think the way to think about it is like, what would get you interested when you read about someone's bio, right, or their story? What typically gets you surprised? Like for me, as an example, when Dawn shared the story of how she won over Coke, right, through Pepsi, like that was an example of like, it's like a story that very few people tell, right? Or how she, got the job at the NFL, like things like that, how she got her board roles. So I think, I would just think about what's something that isn't like something that you just Google up right, and find out, but more so like, here's a headline about this guy. And I think the more unique and surprising it is, the more people at Hershey's are going to read this and listen to this, and they're going to be like, oh, Doug, I didn't know that about you, right? Like, oh, that you know, you did this as a side hustle, or what, you know, things like that, like, or that's how you switched from, you know, politics into CPG. Like, I don't know if a lot of people know that. And so I think you just want to I think about it as like, what are headlines that we can use, right? And I think that's success, is if we can get like interesting headlines, right? Like when I think about Kevin George, right? You know, one of the things when we write the article, it's going to be like how this guy was like a bartender and ended up becoming the CMO of like one of the biggest alcohol companies, right? And so, you know, things like that we can take and, you know, use as headliners or snippets, you know, in the post interview.
Got it. I see. That makes sense. Cool. No, that's good. It's helpful.
I don't think that there's a question in this, but Daniel had a hard time finding out what this guy was doing for like 10 years from 1990 to 2000. And so you kind of play it as a joke. If you don't remember, I'll jump in. It's like, it was harder for us to, you know, unpack what happened in that decade from the time you started with Look Like in politics and then ended up at L'Oreal. You know, how did you make the switch? What were you doing in that decade? Something like that.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting one. Yeah, he was actually in politics, huh? That's so interesting.
Yeah, and I think about headlines, right? Like how this political campaigner ended up becoming chief digital officer of the biggest chocolate company, confectionery company in the world, right? It's like that's like a headline, right?
Yeah, it's a headline right there. Yeah.
Anytime it's like contrasting and just a bit of a shock factor, it's like, oh, that's surprising. Like you didn't take the typical path. Like we had when we did the CEO of Ralph Lauren, like he was like, yeah, I like wrote a book to pay my way through tuition. Like that was my side hustle to survive. I'm like, oh, that's like an interesting story, right?
Yeah. How did you find out that he was a political campaigner? I didn't see it on.
Daniel did some digging.
Got it.
Yeah. But the way I would frame it, just to be safe, because sometimes what we get, like for example with Bracken, right? Like he had said in an interview that he's like, he didn't have any turnaround experience, right? And then when we asked him the question, he's like, well, I actually did have some turnaround experience, right? With Old Spice and something. So the way I would frame it is like, I think like versus like assume that it's a high certainty, like, oh, you were a political campaigner. It's like, yeah, in our research, I think we noticed that you were a political campaigner, or like we're in politics or something. Like, was that right? Or and then that way you don't presume that was actually what happened, just to be safe.
Yeah.
Have you met him before?
Yeah.
Or one-on-one?
I met him one-on-one, but we had a dinner sometime. In a bigger group, about 5-6 people.
Okay, cool.
Credit Suisse had put together a dinner, and
Yeah.
we were working with Credit Suisse with on some articles and stuff, and so they invited me to that thing.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, I met him a few years ago at Shop Talk when he was a speaker.
Okay.
Yeah. He was still at Unilever at the time.
Okay. Is it pronounced Tag Heuer?
Tag Heuer, yeah.
No, okay.
Yeah. I was trying to see if Tag Heuer sells on Amazon, but it's not 1P, it's all 3P. A friend of mine's the chief commercial officer at Tag Heuer, but don't think it's a bullseye for us.
Yeah.
All right, he is joining. I'm gonna let him in. Okay.
Yeah.
Hey, Doug.
Hey, how's it going?
Good.
Guru,
Good to
hey,
see
Ray.
you.
Hey,
Good to see you as well.
Good to see you. Your voice is very clear. What headphones are they?
Oh, they're these gamer headphones of my son's that they're probably like circling different colors on the sides too. So
Nice.
yeah, but they're actually really comfortable, but they look like I'm in like I should be playing Microsoft Flight
You
Simulator
definitely
or
look
something
like
that.
you're in a tournament. You're going to a tournament.
Yeah, 120 frames per second.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, Doug, thank you for doing this. I was just saying to Guru, I think like you and I met maybe years ago at Shop Talk. I think you were speaking.
Yeah.
And I remember, I think it was Tamara Rogers or AC Eggleston. One of them at Unilever had mentioned them to you, to you. And so anyway, it's good to reconnect after all these years. And,
Yeah, it was Tamara.
Oh, it was, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I'm excited to do this and to hear your story. It was pretty funny. We're actually not sure. We were doing some like digging, and I feel like there was a stretch. Did you start off in politics? Is that the story, or?
No, you know what? It's so funny that you guys found that, because I went to my CV. I'm like, there's no way I put anything in here about politics, but it must be somewhere on the internet. But yeah. I didn't start out in politics, but what my brother was really active when I was a kid. And so I met a lot of like the, people that end up being like the state senators of Michigan.
Got it.
Or people that ended up in, some of them ended up in the Bush White House, Spence Abraham.
Got it.
I think the first Bush, not the second, or maybe it was the second. I can't remember at this point. But when I was a young kid, I remember going to see Gerald Ford speak.
Okay.
I went and saw Ronald Reagan speak. You're probably thinking, I know where this is going in terms of the political spectrum.
Yeah.
But yeah, I stayed active through college.
I think that's where it was. I think it was in your LinkedIn where it said worked on a variety of political campains at Michigan State, and so.
Yeah, it would have been in college, and then a little bit. I had moved to Chicago after college, and I did one like local campaign, and then I wasn't into it after that, but.
Okay.
Yes, my politics have evolved, though, I must say.
Okay, cool. We just wanted to make sure we as we were doing some research, and then there was like a bit of a decade too before I think it was L'Oreal that we were hoping to dig into a little more. We couldn't find out as much, but anyway, we can go straight into this, but we just want to double check before jumping into it.
Yeah, no. I was like, wow, that's from the past. I'm like, we can forget about that if you want. You please just edit that out.
No. It was neat though. I was like, that's an interesting headline that we can have from political campaigning to chief digital officer.
Yeah, that probably sounds a lot snappier than what I'm about to tell you. So
cool.
As we go through this, Doug, and maybe Ray, that's what you're going. Like, if you at some point, like, this will be recorded, and at some point after the call, if you want to look back and say, hey, that particular thing, can you just edit that out? Totally cool. So let us know after the fact if you want us to take something out of what you said and stuff like that. Happy to do that. And also, just to keep in mind who the audience is. This is typically, call it like early to mid-stage folks in large corporate America. There's as we talked about in the email as well, that most of the podcasts, they happen with entrepreneurs. The entrepreneurial journey is kind of really celebrated a lot, but not many talk about corporate folks who've risen up the corporate ladder and are C-levels and stuff like that. This is really towards those stories. We're dedicating this leadership series towards the story of folks who've made it in corporate America, right? So that's sort of the audience that if you want to keep in mind, you obviously want to hear about decisions you made and, some eventful and uneventful things that happened, what you jumped at, those kind of things.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely.
Ray,
great. Thanks for the brief.
Yeah, no, I think we're going to jump straight in because we'll do an intro recording separately. So we're going to dive right into it. And if we move from topic to topic, it's okay. We'll do some editing. But
no worries.
We're looking forward to this. It'll be fun. Guru will lead most of them, and you'll see me jumping in from time to time.
Great.
Thanks. Cool. So maybe we can just start with your time at Michigan State. First of all, how did you decide to go to college at Michigan State?
Yeah, I wish I had a really great answer for this. But in my family, obviously we all grew up in Michigan. There was 4 kids. I had 1 brother, 2 sisters. My brother went to U of M. I had 1 sister who went to Eastern, but then got her master's somewhere else. I can't remember. It's somewhere in DC. I can't remember which university. And then 1 sister went to Michigan State, and so kind of we were all like divided up in terms of our loyalties in terms of the schools within Michigan. But the two big choices were U of M and Michigan State, and I ended up picking Michigan State for 2 reasons. The first one is that my hometown was right on the edge of Ann Arbor, where the University of Michigan was, and I felt like I really knew that culture and really knew Ann Arbor, and I didn't want to feel like I was at home, or you have an excuse to go home. And so I went the amazing distance. Instead of 15 or 20 minutes away from the school, I went, like an hour. That was a long ways back then. And went to Michigan State. And when I went to Michigan State because I did orientations at, a couple schools. When I went to Michigan State, it was late April. It was the first really nice day of spring. It was sunny. It was warm. And if I'm totally honest, all the young ladies were out playing Frisbee out in the fields, and everybody looked healthy and happy. And I said, I think I want to go to this school. It's so much more vibrant than Ann Arbor. And it wasn't a bad choice. I still have, lifelong friends. And that I keep in touch with, and I helped start a fraternity there, which is now the biggest fraternity on campus. It's too cool for me. I couldn't get into my own fraternity now, but I built a lot of long relationships at the school, and so that's how I got there, and I think it was a good experience.
So tell us a little bit more about that fraternity. That's a very interesting story. Was that like an entrepreneurial bug that you had, or something to start new and stuff?
Well, it was funny. So it was Pi Kappa Alpha, Iota chapter. And what ended up happening is I lived in a dorm, like most of us do the first couple of years of school. And, all the people in my dorm were like, they were all my, new best friends. And all of us knew kind of from a like a resume builder perspective and an experience perspective that, you know, being in a fraternity would be a probably a good thing and a good way to network. But we were just rebellious enough to think like, well, we don't want our fraternity to be like every other fraternity on campus. We want it to be like our own fraternity. And as it turns out, there was a group of guys that were already kind of doing that, and it was a very small group. And so I think when I joined, there was maybe 15 or 20 people. And we were using the Pi Kappa Alpha name with really not with any permission whatsoever. And eventually we got into contact with the national group, and they whittled us back down to, I think, 7 or 8 people, of which I was one. And we were the, you know, kind of the initial officers of the fraternity. And then we built it. And by the time I left, I think there's about 60 guys. You know, by the time I left, we had bought a house. We had a fire engine with beer kegs on it, which was the national symbol of the fraternity, was the fire engine. And, we're starting to make a name for ourselves. And now I think it is the biggest on campus. They're in another bigger house. And I've had 2 of my nephews go through the house as well as legacy, which has been cool.
So yeah, going through the uncharted route, that's great. I can see connect the line from there to being the chief digital officer now.
Well, you know, it's funny. It's funny how you don't know yourself. So I actually think this lends itself maybe to the conversation. You know, that was an atypical choice. You know, a lot of people would have went for like the big established house. I don't know if I could have gotten into the big established house, number one, but I always felt like I wanted to do things on my own terms. And I had a job while in school. I worked full time through my education. And within the job I had, which was an assistant manager of a sporting goods store, I set up like a little company within that store, which dealt with Greek letters. And so we did all the logo wear for all the fraternities on campus, and did a lot of custom screen printing and stuff like that. And so it was like its own little P&L within the store. And you know, I did some work for my brother off to the side. And then when I graduated from school, my first job was with Helene Curtis in Chicago, which ended up being bought by Unilever later on. But and it was setting up an inside sales department. So it's something that I had, you know, noodled around with a little bit at university. And I did a lot of, you know, what would now be called coding, but it was programming back then. And so I built all the systems, all the database systems for an inside sales department, and got that up and running. And so there's always an element of like going into roles and kind of creating something that wasn't there before, you know, with a commercial bent. And quite frankly, I did not even realize I was falling into this pattern. As it turns out, that's the pattern that's driven my entire career.
There's obviously in large companies, when you sort of take that route of going to something which is you're starting from scratch, and the mothership is focused on something else. In your case, it worked out. But in 2012, when you were putting your hat in the ring for being the head of e-commerce, what went through your mind at that point?
Well, that's a really good question. So the interim years from about 2002 to 2009, I worked for a company called TG Hair Care, which is best known for a brand called Bedhead, which was, you know, really hot for a number of years and still exists and still does well. But and we built that company from, you know, being very small to being about a little bit under $300 million. And then we sold it to Unilever. So I went from like big companies, you know, Bristol Myers Squibb, L'Oreal, Louis Vuitton, to, you know, a really small company where, you know, like we literally had to count the cash coming in every week to make sure we could pay people. And that was really new because in a big corporate environment, everything's taken care of for you. And so I learned a little bit about everything, you know. I ran the international businesses. I ran a good portion of the domestic businesses. I had to learn about, you know, supply chain and logistics. I stood up research and analytics and insights. I started digital there. You know, the whole back end of the sales force was built off of systems that my team designed. It's just like a little bit of everything. You know, it was a general management role. And so when I went back into Unilever, even though I had gotten a great education and something really atypical from everybody else that were my peers or my competitive set within Unilever, I knew that I couldn't compete, in some of the bigger category roles, like driving one of the big categories, and or I could have, but it would have been a struggle to kind of like maybe get in there. And so I'm like, okay, well, what am I really, really good at? I'm really good at building things, and so I was really fortunate that because I was acquired, I got a lot of visibility to some of the very senior executives at Unilever, both domestically in the US, but also globally. And, they liked me, and they liked what I heard because I could translate some of the startup-y stuff into corporate speak, because that's where I'd come from, unlike a lot of the other people actually that were at the startup. So the digital commerce thing, the 2012, it really came about as a series of like internal consulting projects. When I was moving off the TG business, I integrated the TG business within Unilever from what we would call like the brand building side, and I'd written the 5-year strategy for it. And I'm like, look, it's now yours. It's not mine any longer. I need to get away from this. And so the dynamic was entrepreneurial mindset, good at building, but missed out on some of the things that I would have learned at a big company if I wanted to run like a big category. So what's the thing where's the area where I can go and like build something from scratch? And kind of like really work the muscle I'm good at. And as it turns out, I was given the opportunity to write a North American digital strategy, and that was picked up and really well received. And then I got calls from the global team, and the global teams are like, you need to do that for us globally. So that I designed the strategy and center of excellence framework for the globe. And I was in that role for like 4 months. And then the guy that was running the US business at the time said, I know this guy from the TG business. He needs to be not just doing the strategy, he needs to run it. And so that I ended up running the North American component. So I brought that whole strategy to life. And it was great. I loved it because it spoke to my strengths. And I made a huge impact. And I think I would have made an impact in anything I attempted to do. I'm a pretty confident guy, but I think it was very much a differentiated impact and easily seen. And so it ended up being one of the plum jobs at Unilever. So it was a real thrill. Yeah, it's a real thrill.
How did you get to write the strategy? Like that seems like a good move that you made in terms of getting the role to write the 5-year strategy for e-commerce.
Yeah, honestly, I think it was probably my single best career decision ever. I thought, up until that point, I was so proud of what we had done at the startup. It was small potatoes compared to some of the things you see now, but we sold it for a pretty nice sum, and I was really, really proud of the experience. And so, in thinking through the approach, I kind of felt that, and hopefully I'm answering your question, so course correct if I'm not. Nobody really knew how to do anything as it related to digital. And so the reason that, but I had enough chops from standing up some of the digital at my at TG that I felt comfortable. And I'm a bit of an autodidact, right? So I was not necessarily a great student per se, but I'm a great learner. When I'm really interested in something, I'm really interested. And so I just set out to learn more about the digital space than anybody else in the building. And then that got translated into, designing strategy. And I had done strategy already because I had run a company, with a global footprint. So there's a lot of considerations and a lot of things that I could draw on to make sure that the digital strategy was actually very commercially oriented, and made sense for the company. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that was a bit of the thinking. And I think the one thing I said to my wife too was, in terms of that decision, I'm like, there's no way anybody at this company is going to let this thing fail. And there's really just nobody in CPG that really knows the space anyway. So why not me? That's kind of the attitude. I go, why not me? I'm pretty smart. I think I can figure this out. I've got some of the right skills. I'll figure it out. And I figured it out.
Doug, what was the e-commerce landscape at the time? How different was it?
Oh my gosh, right? So it's funny. So many things have stayed the same in a lot of ways, but a lot of the things that are important now were important then. But the thing that shocked me was, Unilever, they're one of the best marketing companies in the world, like period. And so if you looked at what they were doing from a digital perspective, I would say they were really on top of like digital media and where digital media was going. There's some really smart people at Unilever that really dove into that head first. But from a commerce perspective, they were only really starting to pay attention. And so their broader kind of digital footprint, I was shocked actually when I did like an audit like any consultant would do, right? So I went out and I did a bunch of research and I interviewed all the stakeholders, and I was just shocked that there literally wasn't, beyond a media strategy, really a digital marketing strategy. And if you looked at the digital, it was really focused on digital commerce. And if you looked at the work that we did on that initial strategy, it was really a digital marketing strategy, not a digital commerce strategy. And we did that on purpose because we knew at some point we were going to have to link into media, and we knew at some point we were going to have to link into marketing. We just didn't know when. We had a funny feeling we knew where things were going to go, but we didn't know when certain things were going to happen. So I don't know, does that answer your question?
Yeah, I'm just curious in terms of like the channels that were available at the time versus
there wasn't any, right? So
yeah, exactly.
So it was like Amazon. So I can tell you one of my favorite memories, and things have changed. I'll tell you a related story that was like, wow, it's like, it kind of shocked me. But I remember the first meeting I had with Walmart.com, which would have been like in 2012 or 2013. I went in and I presented the Unilever global strategy, and then how we were going to bring all these things to life, from, content management, search optimization, conversion, techniques, et cetera, et cetera. And I presented it, and the person at Walmart.com, who was our key contact at the time, looked at me and she said, "Aren't you afraid that you're going to be way ahead of your retailers?" And I was like, of course I said no. I'm like, well, why wouldn't I want to be ahead? But I think that was like a real signal to me that I had learned a lot, number one, and had really looked at where I thought the landscape was going, and had a really good sense and vision to where it could go. Because all the things that are happening now were already happening then. It was just they were compartmentalized and happening to different categories. And so to me, convenience and e-commerce were only going to move in one direction, right? And so that it was a good learning, because I had to recalibrate to a certain degree my expectations of what our retailers could do. But at the same time, it made me feel like, wow, I'm, either I have a knack for this, or, I've done my homework and I felt very comfortable. Now, interestingly enough, if you go another 7 years in the future, I remember when I joined Hershey, I went and I visited Target, and I talked to a lot of the same people that I had been talking to for years at Unilever, where, I'm exaggerating a little bit, they used to hang on my every word. And like, what's he bringing? Like, what's the new crazy idea that he's going to bring? And what's that going to lead to in terms of the partnership? And I went in there and I was talking to these guys that I'd known for years, and they were like total pros. Like everything that I had been talking about a couple of years before that I had to keep repeating over and over again, they were like all over it and then some. And I remember coming out of that meeting saying, yeah, I got to sharpen my saw, because the retailers they were catching up really, really quickly. This is pre-pandemic too. And I still feel that way. I'm in the midst right now of not relearning, but doubling down and reconnecting to people like, quite frankly, you guys, to learn what's the state of the state, and to basically recalibrate my brain to the certain extent in terms of thinking about like, what's the next couple steps that are going to happen, because I don't want to fall behind.
What are the other crazy ideas? Maybe some that worked, some that did not work outside of digital.
Yeah, so it goes back to Ray's question, like, like what's different. So I remember I was talking to a company. I don't even remember I remember the gentleman I was talking to, but I don't remember the company. It's because he's moved to like the 3 other companies now. But they were working on, a technology. It was essentially a personalization and recommendation technology that would allow you to, it's like recipe to cart, which at the time was like, no one was really doing it. It was more of an idea than it was a real thing. And I remember I had like 3 or 4 conversations about it, and I was getting really excited about it because I had gotten exposure to the global e-commerce footprint and what was happening in the UK and what was happening in Korea and China. And I know it sounds like I'm going to be the dumbest guy ever, but it took me a little while to realize that there was no retailer that had an infrastructure to actually implement the widget that I was planning to kind of create with this company. And so I had to go to the company and say, what I've realized is that there's no commercial application for this. There's no retailer that's even remotely ready to implement this. And so it's not worth torturing each other and going through this. So it's a really cool idea, and I know it's working in other parts of the world, but it is not going to work here, and it's not going to work until certain infrastructure is in place. And that infrastructure honestly did not get into place until 5 years later.
I feel as well, I feel like Instacart had tested something out. I don't know how big that recipes portion of their business ended up moving to, but I feel like people have tried that concept for recently.
Yeah,
too.
well, there's a lot. I mean, there was a lot of companies that were coming at it from all sorts of different angles. Some of them were kind of more media angles. Some of them were more commerce angles. So there's been elements of kind of like, add multiple items to a cart. For a while. I don't think it really got elegant until maybe the last 2 years. I think you're going to continue to see that it is going to gestate and evolve, and it is a real thing, and it should be. Both recipe to basket, and then I would say from basket to recipe, we're like, hey, add one more ingredient. Not only can you make chocolate chip cookies, you can make some other, delicious recipe as well. So, all those things are in play and being tested out, but there was no click and collect. The delivery business was coastal and limited to just a few cities. And so it was really funny how I was thinking like, oh, I'm gonna make this big splash with this amazing partner. And then I had to realize after I did, more analysis that, I was gonna blow a bunch of money and time and not have anything to show for it.
But I feel like you're an early adopter in a lot of ideas because they've all started to happen, right? Like there's HelloFresh and Blue Apron that's sort of a derivative of what you're talking about, and there's these things have happened, just timing.
Yeah. And some of the things that I had mentioned, like there was one thing I had pitched to one retailer. It was like a shop along technology, like to allow people to basically in your family add to like the cart wish list, so that when the primary shopper, usually a mother, went to the store, they would have like the shop along list from all the different people in the family. Well, those types of things like are totally happening. But when I was pitching them, the first was like, I don't know if we can do that, and then the second thing was like, the response was more like, how can we monetize this and then charge you for your own idea? So I learned pretty quickly that, it was okay to have good ideas, but you had to be careful about how you positioned them. And one idea, which actually we've been bringing to life at Hershey, was I called it Project Minority Report. And essentially, it was a really poorly thought through version of what I would now call online category management or online category captaincy. So it was, how do you in almost real time take the data that's coming through websites, study the behavior, understand how they're interacting with the categories. What categories are they coming from their shop before they hit your category? Where are they exiting to? What are things being bought with? All of those things that would be elements of the physical world and thinking about category management. I was thinking about them through the lens of digital, and as it turns out, there was no real way to do it at the time. and I couldn't articulate what I was really after because I wasn't quite sure what it was. And eventually someone articulated it for me and I revised it. And then we started to chase it down a bit at my former company, and we're just crushing that concept at the Hershey Company. We hired a really talented woman to drive it. So I had like the vision, but didn't really know what that meant. And she has just taken it to amazing new levels. So we get a lot of data from our retailers that a lot of our competitors don't. So it's a fairly unique, at least at this point, it's a fairly unique capability that they're trusting us with, their clickstream data and their search data and a lot of other things that most people don't have access to, but we've demonstrated that we can make magic out of that. And so that's been really cool. But, that was an idea that like, it was poorly articulated 7-8 years ago, and it finally is like really, becoming something. And I'm not going to say I'm the 100. I'm sure it was thought of by a lot of people because it's propped up in other places, but I do know at least the inkling of it I had early on. It was just a matter of things catching up.
You should share the idea with Guru and then have him sell it back to you.
Yeah. Well, it was funny because I had an employee. I'm like, hey, I have this idea, and I pitched it to them, and they were like, that's not an idea, that's a company. And I'm like, oh, well, I never thought of it that way, but I guess it was. But I didn't know if I had the appetite to go out and do all that again.
I think the secret is we learned so much, maybe the most of the things we learned by talking to industry practitioners and heads like yourself, Doug. So that's reality. That's the dirty reality of all this. But actually, you're sticking to that concept. Looks like you've had a number of things in your ideation which came to life sooner rather than later. Some took time, some took immediate effect. Now it would be remiss of me not to ask a question in terms of what do you foresee? Let's connect the dots and look the next 10 to 15 to 20 years. How do you see this e-commerce industry or digital industry transforming, especially when it comes to CPG?
Well, we just actually did some wargaming around it, and I think that this is the most overused comment over the last year as it relates to almost everything, but particularly e-commerce, which is the pandemic changed everything. So I wasn't surprised by what happened with the pandemic. Of course, the speed was absolutely breathtaking, but it really didn't change any of the underlying trends. Like, I think convenience only moves in one direction. Things are going to get ever more convenient. And I think so, early on, the way I described it internally was, right now everybody's worried about contactless, but then once they get used to the convenience, it's going to be all about convenience. And I said, the longer we have a pandemic, the stickier this is going to be. And I think that's, the data is starting to bear that out. And I think, we're going to reach, penetration that we didn't think we were going to hit until, 2025, basically maybe by the end of this year. So I think that's there. But the thing that I really think about is, there's a couple things, and some of these are going to be really category specific because they keep me up at night in terms of making sure that I can protect my business as a steward and a shareholder of the Hershey Company. But in our business, we're the masters of space. Right. So we're category captains for, I think, all of our major customers. And we're really well known. We win awards every year for our prowess in captaincy or in category management, I should say. And now we're extending that into digital in really cool ways. And that's all integrated. That was one of the things that I actually handed over at the end of last year. So it's like off and flying. And we talk about space just as everybody does. But the elephant in the room is that you've got penetration of e-commerce approaching 10, 11, 12%, depending who you're talking to. You've got predictions that it's going to go to 18, 20, maybe 25 in the US. And you think, oh, will that really happen? And it's like, well, China's at like 55%, or some crazy number that I saw in eMarketer the other day. And so what I'm thinking is like, okay, so we're really good in the physical world and we're thinking about space. And we typically, talk about how much square footage, did we gain? And then we translate that literally into like football fields and miles, like, oh, we gained 100 miles of space. And it's like, well, that's great. But like by definition, if it goes to 20% e-com, you don't need all that number one, you might not need all the square footage. And if you do need the square footage, you need it for something else, which is probably micro fulfillment or whatever. And then that whole area that that people, like shoppers, actually interact with is going to be bereft of low engagement categories. Things that are no fun to shop for. Toilet paper is one of the favorites from the pandemic. And so, the way you position yourself, the way you merchandise yourself, and the way you engage with consumers, I think is just going to drastically change, and it's going to change with a lot less space. So then the space race is like, well, how much space can you gain on a screen? And so that's the way, that's what I talk about a lot. I don't know exactly how it's going to manifest itself. I think we learn as we go. Definitely the holistic category, approach that we're taking is the right approach philosophically, but the mechanics of how it's really going to come to life is going to be fascinating, particularly if you think like there's billions of dollars being spent by Walmart and Target in terms of remodeling their stores. Well, what are those stores going to look like? And how does our category play within those stores? I think it will play for certain, but it will be different. And we need to be ahead of what that means and understand what that means so that we can get the most out of it, both for ourselves, but obviously for our retail partners. So that space thing is a big thing. I also think a lot about, and again, it's a bit category specific, what's going to happen with small format stores. So small format stores, as you guys might know from an e-commerce perspective, they don't really do e-commerce. There's been experiments, 7-Eleven with drones and partnerships with, the likes of Uber and whatnot, but there hasn't really been kind of like a full push. And part of that is just the economics, relatively small basket sizes, and ubiquity of the locations, and a number of things. But they really suffered in the pandemic, and now it looks like they're going to come back. But then you've also got the whole world by maybe 2030 or 2035 is going to be electric, and you won't be filling up your car at the gas station. You'll be filling it up in your garage where the plug is. And so I think that's something that I think about. I just think the environment of space and then the element of convenience, or how we define convenience, is going to totally change. Already is changing. And so how that manifests itself in the next 5 to 10 years, I think those are probably the two primary in my head.
But how do you foresee all this change happening? Do you think it's going to be like this one big bang at some point? The company realizes, makes a huge change. This is how we have to do, or is it going to be sort of incremental as you go, and you wake up to a 2030 which looks very different, but it's happened in multiple steps?
Yeah. I think it depends on what. If I was to think like, my sales force that reported into me, my shopper marketing or digital merchandisers that reported to me, and category management and a couple other pieces, I literally gave that whole thing over to the appropriate functions within the organization. So in some cases I had people that went to media, and in some cases they went to category management and sales and shopper marketing. And I wasn't planning on doing that for like another 18 months. And we did it like in 6 months last year. It's 22 work streams that we went through. And so that was one of those things where it's like, we need to do it now. And part of it was to honestly, was to free me up executionally from the day to day, so I could start to answer questions like the questions that you guys are answering or asking me right now. And so that's what my focus is now, is just thinking about like, what are the disruptive business models going to be? What are the capabilities going to be? So I think there could be other external shocks, black swan events that, like they force us to make decisions very quickly and we kind of pick up the pieces from there. I think other things will be incremental. I think it just depends. I wish I had a better answer on 15 years out. If I did, I wouldn't be working. I would have been playing the stock market.
Oh, that's fair. That's fair. The things are changing so rapidly. It's hard to predict. Going back to your jump from coming from Unilever to Hershey's, curious if there were things that you had to unlearn because the products are different, the categories are different, and you're now playing in a very different space.
Yeah. So the first is the importance, and it goes back to the convenience store comments from a few minutes ago. A good portion of our business is impulse driven. So people, they see the candy, they buy the candy, and then they eat the candy. So thinking through that was one of the primary, when I came on board from Unilever, it was one of the primary things that they were worried about. They're like, if there's no checkout lane, and those are really profitable items, how do we think about that? And I honestly did not have an answer. My intuition was, and I talked to a bunch of people that I knew at Unilever and outside of Unilever overseas, was, okay, so if the business in the United States shifts to online grocery, and we think it's going to, and the infrastructure is being built, how did you manage it over in the UK? I mean, it's like this really simple question, like what happened? What did they do to like kind of make up for these things? And so there was a sense that there needed to be some sort of kind of like technological solve, like add this item or recommendations as you were checking out that were similar, I think, to or analogous to something that was happening in the offline world. But then the other thing was, and I think all the data has borne this out. There's a couple other things like, well, online baskets tend to be bigger. And people shop from two primary sources, like 80% of the things they're going to add, maybe 85% are going to come from either search or the previous list, like what they bought before. So what I said was, well, instead of, really, really getting, terrified of the impulse behavior, it was more, and then reacting to it and trying to recreate that online. I was like, I don't know if you can create it online. It's a different experience. Of course, you want to mitigate it to the degree possible, but I'm like, probably we need to put our focus here and drive like this regular cadence of people automatically putting candy in their shopping cart instead of 4 times a year putting it in their shopping cart as they're going through the checkout line, beyond, say, I would say like your seasonal occasions. And so that's what we really focused on. And I think that worked. The other thing was just, margin compression. All CPGs think about the margin compression and, how are the retailers going to react? And so there's a lot of, particularly from the sell side analysts, a lot of questions around, well, how are you going to do that? And our answer to that was, well, if you're thinking that only our e-commerce business is only a ship to home model, like an Amazon model where a brown box shows up, it's not. And in fact, over time, as it relates to food, as the infrastructure ramps up with retailers, it will move to click and collect and delivery. And the margin profiles are really different. So we're going to optimize for where we think it's going to go, as opposed to where it is now. And, we, double-digit increases in our gross margins as we started to pivot and think about the business in a different way. So we improved our share, we improved our gross margins, we improved everything just by, looking at it and thinking like, what's unique about digital that we can leverage, and then where are the areas that we can play and win that aren't as dilutive to the business. And those are the things that both, some of it carried over, but some of it was new to the category that I had to think about. And it melts in summer.
Yeah, that's a big challenge for you guys. So you, in the formats that you mentioned, you did not mention DTC. I did notice that you have a Hershey's shop.hersheys.com and stuff, but it doesn't seem like it's on top of your mind. Let me ask you a very direct question. Is DTC dead?
No, it's not dead, but it's been and is being, as we speak, focused. So we look at it as an important part of the business in terms of understanding our consumers and particularly our loyal consumers. We look at it as a driver of brand engagement and brand equity. And the tie into our physical, both our sister companies in resorts, but also our own retail environments and the chocolate worlds that we have in a couple different places around the world. And so from that standpoint, data acquisition, understanding behavior, and engaging with loyalists, it's doing exactly what we need it to do. Is it going to be the thing that drives our top line and our bottom line, in the future? No, I think there's other things that will do that, but it is a component of our overall brand strategy.
Makes sense. One of the things which a lot of e-commerce leaders really think about is talent, right? The e-commerce talent is very, very sought after right now. So are there things that you do that have worked really well for you? You seem to be running a really tight and a really solid team out in your shop.
Well, I think there's two answers to that question. So what I found is a really effective way to to talk to the type of talent that I thought we needed. Many of whom were coming from like .com experiences and the Amazons of the world, is to say well, let me say, like, and this is stereotyping. I'm saying it for effect, but you've got a lot of really smart people coming out of those companies. Like, they recruit for really good people, they get really good people, and those companies like an Amazon, they're on a tear, right? So the initial reaction of the people that come out of those environments, like, well, I grew my business by X amount, and I'm like, the whole business was growing by X amount. I'm like, you want a professional challenge? Tell me how I can grow this category double digits for the next 5 years when, in the physical world, it's growing by 2, 3, 4%. I'm like, you figure that out? That's a huge accomplishment. And a lot of people really believed in that. They were like, yeah, that is a real challenge. And so we were able to kind of recontextualize and instead of saying like CPGs are kind of like these old legacy companies that have to adapt, and they have really good marketing talent and maybe good manufacturing and logistics talent, but they're not going to be able to attract. It's like, but think about what you're dealing with is in terms of your business opportunities and the problems that you have to solve for, and just making it exciting, because they are exciting. Hershey's been in business for 125 years. And, a lot of companies kind of like enter and exit the Fortune 500 in a much, much shorter time frame than that. So making sure, and coming up with the solutions to keep a company going successfully for another 125 years, you can get people interested in that kind of a mission. And I've also been lucky to work for companies that actually have real mission and real purpose. That is a big talent driver. If people think you're doing good for society and you're doing the right things ethically, a lot of people really look for that. And so if you can tap into that, you can recruit the right type of people. I've never suffered for talent.
On that note then, Doug, how do you, especially in the last 1 year, it must have been pretty difficult. It was quite difficult for a lot of leaders to keep the environment intact and motivate teams. Are there any personal tactics or advice that you have for managers on how you've been able to address that challenge in terms of managing and motivating your team during these tough times?
I think the first challenge is managing yourself. Anything that you're going through as a leader, you can try to fake it or act your way out of it, but people are going to see it. It's going to manifest in some way. So like everybody, I was a little bit scared. And definitely there was a lot of anxiety, and I just kind of let it all hang out. I was like, look, I understand. I'm freaked out too. I don't know what's going to happen. But the way I contextualize it, and again, I'm lucky because of the space I'm in, is I said, if there was ever a time, this is to the team, if there was ever a time this company needed your help, it's right now, because we are going to be the net beneficiaries and drivers of keeping a lot of things afloat. And I wasn't 100% certain that was actually the case, but as it turned out, it was absolutely true. And I think that was a way to kind of help sustain kind of the belief in the mission and the importance of the work that we did. The other interesting thing was actually, we decided in the midst of all this, like what was going to end up being my best commercial year ever, because of a pandemic of all things, is when we decided to make the biggest, most radical organizational change by taking parts of my organization and moving them into other parts of the organization where they fit, and then taking on new and different responsibilities to continue to drive kind of the future forward work that we're doing. And so it was a really interesting balancing act of, hey, we're more important than we ever were, but all of a sudden, some of my teammates are going to other teams, and how disruptive can this be? And so again, it was a lot of contextualizing, like, if you're going to do it now, and here's the reason why. And then beyond that, honestly, I set up I've had office hours all along, but I made sure that I did one-on-one video conferences with every single person on my team. It didn't matter what work level. It didn't matter what they were working on. I wanted to talk to everybody and make sure that they knew, that they could call, and if they're having a problem to let me know, and we could talk it through if they wanted that. And not everybody wanted that, but I think the availability was key. That said, it's been a slog. I won't lie. In the winter was really dark. It was really dark for me personally.
Have you found that you've been working more during the pandemic, and how have you sort of changed the way you've structured your schedule and the way you operate?
I think initially I was working more. The time that I would have taken commuting and listening to a podcast, about whatever, it could be digital commerce, could be politics. I was doing work, right? So it wasn't kind of like I had an extra 45 minutes to chill out in my car, which is kind of like your decompress before you go into the battles, and your decompress after the battles when you go into work. I was working from like just whenever I woke up essentially to whatever time. And we were doing, like, we redid the strategy, and we did all the integration work, the digital acceleration work that I've been referring to. That was all going on. And so it was full on, and I basically collapsed in November and December. And I had to really rethink over the holiday season how I was going to, conduct my own life to a certain degree, because I had no energy left. And I've typically been the kind of person who always has some, gas in the tank, but I just couldn't do it anymore. So, I'm not ashamed. I'll take a nap in the middle of the day. If I have a half hour and it says focus time, sometimes I do work, but sometimes I'm like, you know what, I'm just going to go and shut down for a little bit. And then when I come back to my next meeting, I'm in such a better place. And then I make sure that, or I'm trying to make sure that I get out of here once in a while. So I have a second home, and I find that just leaving my house here, my work house, even for a couple days, like, makes me so much more productive. I don't know if it's just the monotony or what it's, like Groundhog Day, the movie. But I find that change of pace is really, really helpful, at least for me.
That resonates a lot. And are you doing things like, say, bookending, the start or end of the day and stuff? How do you make sure that it doesn't bleed through the entire day? I just stop. Honestly, I have one more meeting after this. And after that, I won't look at my emails except for the only thing I'll do is check my schedule for tomorrow, just to make sure there isn't some deliverable I forgot.
to get myself mentally prepared and just do, one sweep in terms of, did any emergencies come in? But it used to be that I would be checking my, email like everybody else, like every 5 minutes and reacting to it and not really being in the moment. And I've not completely, but everybody has to continue to work on it, but I've mostly let that go. And now every night we have a dinner as a family, typically together. And then my wife and I sit together and, we might watch some, really stupid TV show. But like we do that, and then we chat, we talk to family, and, but before, that might've been peppered in with a lot of work, conversations, et cetera, et cetera. Those have kind of gone away now.
That's amazing. Coming to in terms of what if you were to say recommend a book to read or podcast that you used to listen to, what are the top ones that you would recommend someone to listen to or read?
That's a really good question. So there's a lot. I have read a lot of books. I've read, I'm just going to tell you what I've been reading. So I've read A History of Medieval England, a book on Alfred the Great, which is really inspiring, actually. I've read a couple books in Buddhism. I've read a couple political books. I'm in the midst of reading the Lost Kingdom series. I guess it's 13 books. They made it into a Netflix series, which I loved. And I'm like, I'm going to read these. And so like in 3 days, I've read 3 of them. So, so that in terms of books, I haven't really been like reading business books. I've been reading more like history, a history of Japan. And I love reading those because if you think about it, like a lot of these countries went through like huge upheavals. The pandemic was a huge upheaval. We've been having a lot of cultural upheavals in the country. And it's really remarkable when you go back and you look at you read about these times in history, you automatically think those people were really unsophisticated because we live in the 21st century and we have all this technology. As it turns out, it's really not that different. from a sociological, political, and power perspective, it's just amazing how many of the same tactics and same themes actually come up, and that's actually why I've been enjoying reading these these histories that take place over a couple hundred years. Is you see these ebbs and flows of freedom and authoritarianism and monarchy versus democracy versus whateverism, and it's just really fascinating. And I think it informs kind of like sometimes my approach to just, business or how I'm, positioning myself within whether it's a personal relationship or a business relationship.
That's fascinating, Doug. Maybe one last question here before we call it a day. Anything that you're looking for in the next, after the world opens up, a personal bucket list item that you're looking forward to doing?
Yes, I really, really am missing trips overseas. So typically, in my past, if you guys researched me, I've had global roles and I've done business all over the world. I really like visiting other places, particularly places that are, completely different from the culture that I'm in, and learning about people and getting to understand people and learning about the environment, reading the histories. Obviously, I've an interest there, and we haven't been able to do that. And so I want to be able to go. And so we're talking about, Iceland, or, this is more for my kid because I've been to some of these places, Australia, Singapore. So we'll see how it goes, but I'm just dying to do that. And to take my son with me, get him exposure to how other people live and understanding of, how things are different and how things are the same.
Amen to that. Thanks, Doug. Thanks for your time today.
Yeah, I hope you had fun.
Yeah.
No, this was great. Doug, I actually do you have like 2 minutes or one final question?
Of course.
I'm actually just curious, as you went through the TG experience to Unilever, and you've seen Unilever, and I haven't followed Hershey's acquisitions, but I think a lot of these folks who come from startups, right? They seem to think they know everything, and then they get exposed to the mothership of a Unilever or a P&G, and they're like, holy shit, like they're actually really sophisticated. I'm curious if you had a similar experience moving from TG to Unilever, and sort of like what might surprise companies, startups that end up getting acquired by larger businesses like Hershey's and Unilever?
Yeah, the first thing is there was only really like 2 or 3 other people that I had to deal with at the startup in terms of like running decisions, through the machine, right? And we were all so tightly coordinated, right? So like the other 3, or I would say actually 4, the other 4 key decision makers, like I just walk down the hall or walk up the stairs, have a conversation, and we could like literally just like make a decision based on whatever data that we had. And so, you knew the business inside and out. Like I still remember SKU numbers and their cost of goods from 20 years ago. Like it's just crazy, but that's how well you knew those businesses. And so you're right. You kind of think like, well, I know everything about how we procure and how we, pick, pack, deliver. I know, everything about the product mix, not just in the United States, but in individual customers and individual countries. And I've done this and I've done that. And it was terrific experience that most people, even at big companies, never really get unless they're really fairly high in the organization. And so you have all that and you bring it in, and you're kind of like, wow, it's kind of underappreciated. So the analogy, I was like a mile wide and maybe an inch or 2 deep in a couple areas, super deep in other areas. But in big companies, you have like this huge amount of crazy depth of knowledge into like, how much air do they pump into ice cream, and, like just like crazy stuff. And so it's the appreciation of there's deep sophistication and optimization that goes into those big businesses that in of itself is as complex as running a small company. And that's where people, I think, get kind of messed up. They're like, why are you even worried about X, Y, and Z as it relates to this product when you could be thinking about all these other things? And let me give you an example of that. I haven't worked on a business that hasn't grown over double digits in over 25 years. Every company or startup or division or business within a business I've worked on has been growing double digits. So some of that was luck, particularly early on. I just picked a good company to work with. And then a lot of it was skill that I built over years. I don't really know how to manage gargantuan businesses, say a $10 billion business for 1 or 2% growth. I could do it, I could learn it, but it's not my skill set. So if you're coming from a startup and you're going to a big company, your thinking is around growth, and growth solves a lot of problems. And the difference in a big company, CPGs and other big companies, is that they're so big that the growth is slowed down. It's still meaningful in an absolute dollar perspective, but from percentages, it looks different. And the way you wring profit and growth out of the company is all about optimization to drive growth and profit at the margins. It's not about double digit anything. And I think that's where a lot of people that come from startups get hung up. They're like, why are you worried about these details? Because they're used to kind of growing their way out of their problems. And big companies are more around like, we got to protect this giant machine that we have and then figure out how to kind of grow at the edges. And so I think that affects how people that come in through acquisitions, unless they've been in a big company and have done both, and most people haven't, they get tired, they think it's bureaucratic, they don't understand, and then they ultimately end up leaving a lot of times. So if you can figure out a way to bring the kind of like renegade, rebellious stuff over, but then translate it into the big, so that you can have big impact on the business, then it can be magic. And I was fortunate that I was able to make that transition and be humble to a certain degree well, that I wasn't the guy that was 100% in charge of everything anymore. When we came over, I became, a medium-sized fish in in an ocean, as opposed to a big fish in a really small pond. And both of those things are important for different reasons, and you just have to kind of recalibrate yourself and understand what's driving the motivations of a big company versus a startup.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, I mean, you optimize for a big company, like the changes are huge, right? It's bigger than the startup as an entire business, right?
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah, we're trending towards 10% of our business probably over the next 18 months. And when I started, it was maybe 1/10 of 1%.
Wow. 100x growth. That's
3
crazy.
years.
Yeah. Wow.
That's crazy.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, one could imagine, right? Who buys chocolate online? That's like the notion that you would have 3 years ago.
No one's ever going to do that.
Yeah.
It's like, well, I don't know. They buy everything else online. Someone's going to figure it out. So yeah. Okay, guys, I got to go. I got another meeting. They're pegging me. Cheers.
All right, be well. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
If you enjoyed listening to this episode, it would mean so much to us if you could take a moment to share this show on LinkedIn. To learn more how Guru and his team can help optimize and grow your e-commerce business on Amazon and other retailers, visit commerceiq.ai. Thanks for listening.